Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Archon's Armory. Today, we're continuing our Xenos weapons series with Dark Eldar, the Drukhari, Dark Eldar weaponry, and to a lesser degree, equipment. Without more ado, let's jump right into it. So, with the mythos, there are a couple of things that just have to get disambiguated with the Drukhari, as they are let's just say, complicated faction. They are a subset of Eldar who have found a rather disturbing way of extending their lives. Unlike their Eldari counterparts, the Drukhari have different ways of sustaining themselves when their souls are in danger of being snapped up by the Prince of Pleasure, Slaanesh. Now, the first mythos with their weapon is this dichotomy: pain over killing power, or killing power over pain. Because the Drukhari, because the Dark Eldar don't have soul stones, and because they are constantly in danger of having their souls sapped away and devoured by she who thirsts, they have developed a society based around eliciting the suffering of lesser creatures. Now, a majority of these are human, but there are many other creatures that the Drukhari prey upon, essentially, for their suffering. The eternal damage, or the eternal siphoning of their souls, they have discovered can be topped off, slowed down, or otherwise stymied by consuming the suffering of other living conscious beings. And a lot of their weapons reflect this. So, the first one, pain over killing power. There are certainly Eldar Drukhari weapons that specifically are not designed so much to be perfect killing weapons, as much as they are designed to cause an incredible amount of suffering while killing someone. So, it is a very acute, painful way of dying when you're hit with certain Drukhari weaponry. And on the other hand, killing power over pain. They are an Eldar faction. They have a lot of high technology weaponry, and a lot of it is very lethal, in many cases instantly. So we will talk about which weapons are designed more for the pain over killing power, and which ones are designed for killing power over pain in this video a lot. But understand that not all of their weapons cause a slow, agonizing death, and not all of their weapons cause instant, elegant decapitation either. They are not Eldar. They do not have efficiency in mind. They are here to make you scream and fill their souls back up to make sure that, they don't have to go into the warp to meet She Who Thirsts personally. The next mythos is low variety. There's a lot of things to unpack with the Drukhari, but one of the main ones is that the Dark Eldar are very simply kind of centralized. They do have a lot of raiding bands, they do have a lot of war hosts out in different areas, but they do have one major hub. They have Kamara. They have the Dark Eldar city of Kamara. Kamara, however you would like to say it. I usually say Kamara, or Kamara. So, the idea that this kind of grouping of all of them into one place means that they're all using very similar weaponry is straight up a myth. So there are different cults within the Drukhari. You have the witches, you have the Raks, you have the Bargasi folks, you have the ones who are more associated with the gladiatorial tradition, and then you have the more traditional Eldari warriors and the warrior caste of the Drukhari. So if I were to break it down, each of these different cults or subsectors of society use different weaponry. So you have kind of the abnormal auxiliaries. That would be folks like the flesh melders, the molders, all those guys who mess around with things like homunculi and flesh furniture and things of that nature. And then you have the Drukhari proper, the Drukhari warriors, who you'd see here and here, who are more traditional Eldari fighters. They wear the equivalent of light carapace armor, or heavy carapace armor. In some cases, I would definitely call this probably a little bit heavier, but this is definitely lighter carapace. And they use more traditional fighting weapons as opposed to the homunculi and the flesh melders. Then you have racks, kind of another subset of auxiliaries, these kind of ensorcelled or faded creatures that drop in and out of the warp and use melee weapons. And then you have the witches, which we will talk about quite a bit. The witches are much more of a gladiatorial stand-in. They hone melee weapon combat and their physical bodies to a much higher degree than even the warriors do. So we will talk about that as well. But understand that each of those different subfactions use different weaponry. So there's a great deal of variety, which is one of my favorite things about the Eldar is they're not all using the same thing. It's a great deal of variety, and I've tried to condense it down as best I can for this video. But there are some rare things that I'm sure I will miss. The other thing is, do they use the same weapons as Eldar? And this is a downright no. The Drukhari have a very different way of war. Another reason why I like the Dark Eldar a lot is that their way of war is so divorced from the Eldari way of war in almost every way. The Eldar, as a race, are totally bifurcated. And the ones who survive by topping off their souls with the suffering of others operate both societally, culturally, and militarily completely differently from Craftworld Eldari, who have the soul stones. They have the ability to preserve their lives through non-violent means, through arcane means, and as a result, their society is a lot less tribalistic. It's a lot less inherently violent. Every Eldar is technically still a fighter, but they're not required to be fighting all of the time, which is why things like Farseers can be much more ceremonial, they can be a little bit more fancy, they can be more political. Not so with the Drukhari. The Drukhari are in straight-up blood-on-blood feuds all the time in cults. They're constantly raiding. They have a very violent, actively militant society, but unlike the Imperium, they don't have the infinite numbers that, say, the Guard have. So they're both in contact with the enemy a lot, but the Drukhari are less numerous than humans, and even compared to the Eldar, they can have a little bit of a manpower problem, even if they are a more militaristic society. Are their weapons multi-purpose? Do Dark Eldar weapons work for all enemies, no matter what the weapon? Pretty much no. I'd have to say that a lot of Drukhari weapons are downright useless against certain enemies. Partially it's because of that pain over killing power thing. They value the damage that the weapons do as a tool of suffering, almost as much as they value them as just sheer weapons. Now, many of them do great against a lot of different enemies, and they have plenty of options that make up for the deficiencies of their weaponry, but not all of their basic weapons, for example, their basic infantry weapons, are not multi-purpose. They're not good against every single target that you'll come across, and there are certain targets that they do almost nothing against. You know, even with the Drukhari as they are, being an Elder faction, being an Eldar faction, their weapons are not perfect in every scenario. Same thing with the Eldar, but they have a totally different reason for why they're not perfect in every scenario. For the Drukhari, it's because their prey is specific. They prey upon squishy civilian targets most of the time. So, weapons that penetrate a lot of body armor, weapons that go through, like, heavy defensive structures and things like that, no. The Drukhari don't need to mess with that, because 95% of the time, they're going after unprotected, vulnerable targets, and they're going after them intentionally to try and get as many people as captured and or suffering as possible. So their weapons are designed with that in mind, with the idea that they don't want to be fighting against squads of space marines, or against heavy Imperial Guard vehicles, or against heavy Imperial infantry, or any of that stuff. They wouldn't want to stick around in that fight, essentially. So a lot of their weapons are not designed for it. And then finally, Eldar are powerhouse fighters. They're so quick and agile and feisty, and their reaction speed. Look, the Eldar, 1-for-1, minus the armor, minus any psychic powers, are less strong on average than the Imperial Guardsmen. They're not going to be they're not going to be weaker than every Imperial citizen, but at least the average Guardsman in a fist fight with a Drukhari, who isn't using any weapons or equipment, is probably going to be able to beat the tar out of them. They are physically less powerful than a human. They are much faster, however. So, again, if it was a fist fight, I think a human would come out on top, just because of the fact that down to the muscle, down to the bone, down to all that stuff, 1-to-1, a human is going to be tougher and stronger than the Eldari. But the Eldar is definitely going to be quicker, and he might have a little bit more endurance. It's not clear exactly what their endurance level is, but at least with the Drukhari, their vulnerability to pain is very low. But they can be injured pretty easily because they have weaker bones and because they have less muscle mass per individual, with one interesting exception in the witches. And we'll talk about that later, how the witches operate and why they're a little bit different. But the Eldar fighting style, and essentially the Eldar combat style, especially in melee combat, is based around the idea of speed and technique trumping strength and durability. Because the Drukhari don't wear any particularly heavy armor, again, the absolute heaviest that you will see them wear in terms of an individual is going to be heavy carapace, and even that is relatively rare. But even with these suits you can see here, there are lots of layered, pleated protection, not necessarily large, heavy, monolithic armor. So, their fighting style is very different from humans. It emphasizes their speed, and it emphasizes the fact that they have been around forever. They are practically, not necessarily immortal, but they can age to a very long timeline. They will not suffer from age as much. So they're very intelligent, they're very talented. Some of them, like the witches, have honed their combat skill to an insane level. But even the regular Drukhari will have a decent amount of close quarters combat training, and they are equipped to use it. So that idea of them being powerhouse fighters on their own, it's not necessarily untrue, but they're not powerhouse fighters in the way that you would think like a standard knight or some sort of that is a human knight, like from the medieval era, or some other human fighter. You'd think of them as a combination of strong and skilled, or strong and tough. The Drukhari are a lot more quick, stabby, talent and technique oriented, along with speed and usually a good dose of psychic powers. So we will talk about that in more depth. Moving right on. Sorry, good pictures here. We got a Drukhari. I believe this one would be kind of one of their leadership units. He's got a good old sword here and psychic powers. I'm not going to talk as much about psychic powers with the Dark Eldar. When I get to Psychers, I will talk about them a bit more, because the psychic disciplines that the Eldari and the Dark Eldar use are a little bit odd, and they kind of deserve their own video. I might do that. I might just put them all with all the Xenos in their own category and do a separate Psyker video. We'll see what you guys think. But you can see even here, their protection is flexible, it's relatively light. Drukhari are generally taller than humans, they're a little bit more willowy, they have long, kind of gangly limbs, and the Drukhari are this kind of gray or pale-skinned. To be honest, most descriptions of Drukhari describe them as smelling like burned-out cigarettes and ash. They're not very hygienic creatures. Just going to be straight up with you. So, not the most beautiful creatures in the world. But moving on to the reality of Dark Eldar weaponry, I love these, the white armored Drukhari. This is someone's own custom art, but it's so pretty. He's got like the clave and the white carapace armor. Very pretty. I also like these guys, the kind of classic troopers, because I find their armor super cool. But moving on. So, built to purpose. The Dark Eldar weaponry, all of their arsenal is designed for pain in addition to being very effective killing weapons. Now you might say there's a lot of weapons that kind of look very efficient for killing. How's that going to cause additional pain? It's less that the weapon would be designed for pain and that it's designed that it is designed to cause pain. It's more that the Drukhari weapon is designed to fit their fighting style. So a great example of this is the Kabbalite Clave. These big, cleaver-like hand-and-a-half or two-handed swords. Now, you might think, well, that's a very efficient thing. It could just lop off someone's head. It's a mono-bladed, partial power weapon. Or a partial force weapon, depending on what lore you're talking about, but we'll go into that later. The thing is more, a Dark Eldar would not go for your head first. They wouldn't intentionally go for a lethal strike, especially if you weren't a threat to them. So if they were fighting someone who they knew they could overpower, or who they really didn't fear all that much, they wouldn't go for the head. They wouldn't go for your torso. They would lop off a limb. They would slice off your arm at the shoulder. They would slice off your hand. They would hit you in the back of the knee. They would cut your ACL, or they would cut your Achilles heel. They would intentionally dismantle you with the weapon just to increase the amount of time that you stay in agony, because every second of your soul quavering in pain essentially grants the person who is making you suffer, and everyone around them, extra seconds onto their life. So the Drukhari are very interested in tailoring their fighting style towards that dissembling, almost humiliating type of combat, where they're intentionally not killing you. They're keeping you around in horrible pain as a doormat because your pain is their bread. So built to purpose is kind of that idea. A lot of their weapons are kind of have this back of the head idea of, well, we could make it a hyper-efficient killing tool, but let's make it a hyper-efficient killing tool and then add in this thing that makes it hurt way, way, way worse. The next thing that complements that is most of their specialty weapons. And a lot of their heavy weapons as well. You might ask if they're all built to purpose, if they're all built for that pain idea, even if they are efficient killing tools. How do they get rid of stuff like really specific threats, like heavy infantry or heavy armor, which are basically everywhere, either within the Imperium or within other factions? The answer is that the Drukhari have the right tool for the right job mentality, which I love a lot about them. They have this idea of, well, we have an anti-infantry specialty weapon for anti-infantry. We have a whole bunch of anti-tank weapons because most of our standard infantry weapons are kind of shit at anti-tank. So they have armor-piercing options, and a lot of them, and they're very good, and they're pretty common too. And then they have very good anti-infantry. So kind of the backbone of the force is anti-infantry. Most of their weapons are good against light and medium infantry, and some light vehicles, and then all of their specialty weapons essentially counter the stuff that their standard weapons don't deal with. So, if you have a lot of heavy infantry, let's say Tempestus Scions or Stormtroopers, you would want to bring out a special weapon that does specifically mean and nasty things to people in heavy body armor. Same thing with Space Marines. If you're talking about heavy armor, like medium or heavy vehicles, they have specific anti-armor weapons. In the case of them, they have the big old heat lances, the melta cannons, basically, that they have. The dark lances, that's what they're called, sorry. A lot of the names are going to get mixed up till I get to that slide. But the dark lances are a great one. They're basically on almost every Dark Eldar vehicle, and some of them can carry them as heavy weapons on occasion. So, they have that right tool for the right job mentality, which I like a lot. Lots of unique melee weapons. So, unlike the Eldari, who kind of rely on taking old versions, or not old versions, but like traditional versions of human weapons, whether it's power swords or chain swords, and they rely on those, the Drukhari, they kind of eschew chain weapons almost entirely. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, there are some chains weapons in their arsenal, but they're not a very common sight. Unlike among the Eldari, they are a very common weapon, especially for things like striking scorpions. But they prefer bladed weapons. And you see this with claves, you see this with Kabbalite daggers, you see these with all types of cult weapons, with the witches' weapons, fractal blades, all of that nasty stuff. They have all of these, what we would consider, mono-bladed, relic, or super special weapons, and they're like standard fare. Even their bayonets are fairly universal in a way that isn't as common with the Eldari. And this emphasizes, I think, the idea that the Drukhari, they're not here to kill you quickly. The Eldari, their weapons are made purely for self-defense with the highest efficiency of keeping them alive and keeping you dead. So they are going for full efficiency. The Dark Eldar are breeding in their efficient specialty weapons. None of these unique melee weapons are basic. They're not dealing with some sort of crappy kitchen knife. No, every one of these is like a mono-bladed or a serrated, nasty weapon that is designed to cut like a scalpel, to slice through flesh and bone with minimal resistance. And they're relatively light and easy for a Dark Eldar to wield, because they are not all that physically imposing. They're not going to be swinging around something like a big two-handed warhammer. They have the claves are about the claves and the demi-claves are about the biggest thing that they have, and these even are designed to be used like a cleaver, and they're designed with both hands involved. So all of these unique melee weapons build on that idea of the Drukhari wanting to get in close to absorb more of the agony from the fighting. And the second part of that as well is that they are trained in melee combat more often than the Eldari are. Now, there are some Eldari who are very good at melee combat. Striking Scorpions are one. Some of their other Aspect Warriors, the more generic ones, have melee weapons as well. And obviously the Howling Banshees have power weapons, but a ton of Drukhari units use unique melee weapons, specifically because they have a gladiatorial tradition, and to absorb suffering the more efficient way is to get close to someone. Essentially, the closer you are when you're causing pain, the more you're getting out of it. And because the Eldari don't have to do that, because they don't have to absorb suffering to top off their soul, essentially, which is what's twisted the Drukhari to be the way they are, they don't need as many melee weapons, and they don't need to be as universal. So, another one of the great things that I love about the Dark Eldar is that they have a lot of really cool, really well-designed, honestly, melee weapons for their type. Poisons and toxins and how they differ from the biopoisons of Tyranids. This is an important thing that I wanted to make a note of in the Tyranid videos. I mentioned it in the videos how the biopoison of the Tyranids has to reside within the creature's body, so there's limitations to how physically toxic you could make the mixture. Obviously, we know with things like snakes or poison dart frogs or things like that in our universe, those things can absorb their own poison and they are immune to it. The Tyranids are resistant to toxin. They're not always straight up immune. We know this because the poisons that were unleashed upon them by the Death Guard were actually pretty effective. Granted, that was mixed with chaos, and it was also some seriously virulent stuff, but those toxins and poisons did work, along with other toxins and poisons that we know will work against Tyranids, at least in the short term. So, I put the biological poisons of Tyranids as limited by biology. They cannot be any more toxic than any toxin that we know of in our modern day. The absolute worst versions of those are neurotoxins, things that break down your neurons, that attack your brain, that attack the internal part of you, and essentially kill cells. That's about as virulent as I would expect any Tyranid toxin to get, no matter what, because beyond that point, it will start to kill the creature. On the other hand, Drukhari don't have to carry the poison inside of themselves, which means that they can make their poisons and toxins as virulent and as deadly and as volatile as they want them to be. Which means that Dark Eldar poisons and toxins are probably going to be either way, way worse than the Tyranid ones, or slightly watered down. And why do I say slightly watered down? A lot of the toxins are meant to incapacitate. Why would they be meant to incapacitate? Because the Dark Eldar like taking prisoners. They like to take them back to Kamara and wring every little bit of suffering out of them, so that when they, roll up the proverbial toothpaste that is somebody's soul and kill them, they get the maximum amount of payoff in exchange. So, capturing them is what they want to do. But, on the other hand, when you have weapons that aren't designed to incapacitate via poison, when you have weapons that are designed to kill via poison, they can get some of the absolute most brutal, even non-biological venoms and toxins into their weaponry. Far beyond what Tyranids would be able to produce, in my opinion. So, just keep that in mind. Not all of the weapons are poisonous, but a good number of them are, and some of them are specifically made to be poisonous or to be coated in poison. And they could be either a little bit watered down so that it incapacitates you, or so incredibly virulent that it would kill you upon very little contact. It's very deadly stuff. And it'd probably kill the Dark Eldar as well, if they got damaged by it. The final thing that I'd like to talk about with this is special technology. Like the Necrons, the Eldar and the Dark Eldar are a very old set of races. They have been around forever, and they have lots of technology that is, quite frankly, arcane to our modern-day Imperium. So, we will be talking about a couple of designs, or a couple of weapon systems, quote-unquote, that are going to be a lot more in the I try to explain how it works, and you just gotta take me on faith, because there is no detail on how this scientifically would work. I'm just gonna do my best to explain it to you, but you gotta chalk it up to, that's some weird Drukhari tech that we don't know about. Moving on to the pros and cons of Dark Eldar weapons. Also, I didn't go over these pictures, but these are absolutely beautiful. Highly recommend. Dude, I did not realize how much incredible Dark Eldar art there was until I made this video. I was scrolling down Google for like an hour, like, that's a cool image, and that's a cool image, and that's a cool image. I couldn't decide what to put in here. Moving on. Pros and cons of Dark Eldar weapons. So, a big one is armor penetration. Now, I put this as a bit of a con. A lot of Dark Eldar weapons, from their melee weapons to their standard infantry weapons, are not designed with armor penetration in mind. At least not armor penetration for anything heavier than medium armor. So, again, what is medium armor? Because some people might not have watched the video. Medium armor is light carapace. It is full flak armor, where the entire body is covered, including the head, possibly the face and jaw. The chest is covered in thicker protection than flak armor. Your shoulders are covered. You have gauntlets, thigh pads, a waist skirt of armor, and protection for your shins and the top of your feet. Essentially, the entire front, except for sections of your midsection and your face, is going to be covered with armor that is resistant to standard infantry weapons. Against that medium level of protection, a lot of Drukhari weaponry doesn't have a 100% chance of penetrating and being effective. That doesn't mean that it can't find ways around it. That doesn't mean that it can't win through with a little bit of persistence or some extra shots. But it does mean that they will suffer when they come up against heavy carapace or even light power armor or power armor, as a majority of their standard infantry weapons won't be able to manage penetration with those armor sets. The other thing is that most of their weaponry is not really designed for penetrating vehicles. They have a lot of special weapons for it, but their standard infantry weapons, and even a lot of their standard support weapons and melee weapons, not really going to do the job. Again, that's why I put it as a minor con. It's not a make or break issue for them. They have options, and they definitely keep those options common and close at hand, but they can be a vulnerability. Rate of fire. This is actually a pretty solid pro. Not only do the Drukhari have the pretty much eternal option, no matter what, to go into melee and use their weapons in close combat, because a lot of them have bayonets, many of them have backup melee weapons, but in addition to that, their standard infantry weapons are all either semi-automatic or fully automatic. So they have pretty much the same fire rate that a lasgun does. Obviously, their full auto is a little bit slower, just because most of their weapons are kinetic, or quote-unquote kinetic, rather than being energy weapons, but they are pretty decent in terms of rate of fire. Ammunition supply. This one I put as definitely a bit of a con. A lot of the ammo that the Drukhari use is very special. It's got poison, it's got glass, it's got all kinds of specialty stuff that you couldn't easily make on the run, especially with how the Dark Eldar fleets work, and how most of their ships are not above cruiser in size. The only capital ships that the Dark Eldar have access to are battle cruisers. They call them battleships, but you'll see if I ever do a Void video, they do not measure up as battleships in any way whatsoever. They are battle cruisers with a couple of extra add-ons, essentially. So that isn't really going to give them a huge amount of logistical support. So their ammo supply is definitely a con, just because of the complexity of their ammunition, and because they're all supplied from the same location, and they don't have enough of a navy to maintain a long-term supply. Range. Drukhari weapons aren't really known for being super accurate at a distance. Obviously, they're not using standard, ballistic theorems. They're not using bullets and projected ammunition necessarily. They're using some technology that essentially shoots it out like a rail. This does mean that they could theoretically have pretty good range, but again, as they're not using any real stabilization, as they're not using any kind of rotational force or anything like that, they will likely suffer from an issue with accuracy. I would argue that it probably has a little bit more range than something like a bolt gun or like a Gauss flare like we talked about last time, so I think it would still be able to hit a target at around 450, if not 550 meters accurately. I don't think it'll lose any accuracy at that range, but beyond that range, it may have some issues. And the other thing is, these strikes don't have to hit center mass, so to hit the target at that range is enough. So unlike kinetic weapons like bullets, or unlike laser weapons that lose effectiveness over range, the Drukhari weapons don't really. So I'd put range as neutral or just a tiny bit of a pro. Kind of edge into pro territory there, just because their ammunition is usually designed in such a way that it doesn't need to hit center mass to be lethal. Damage effect and effect on different targets. Effect on different targets is a con. Again, there are individuals who will either be too armored to be killed by the Dark Eldar weaponry. Obviously, there are ways around this, obviously special weapons, but the effect on target of many of the standard Drukhari infantry weapons is inferior to a lot of other factions. For example, even their basic weapons in comparison to a lasgun are going to do less damage to something like heavy body armor, because the lasgun actually expends all of its killing power into damaging the protection, whereas the Drukhari weapon has only its relatively inferior kinetic impact damage as opposed to the real payload, which is the poison. So the effect on different targets is worse, but the damage effect is a pro. Almost all of their weapons have the ability to penetrate and release poison. Their basic infantry weapons do. A lot of their other weapons have some other similar secondary effect. So if it manages to penetrate, it can be very effective, and it can kill targets very efficiently, or horribly painfully, depending on, again, that dilution of the poison. But those are kind of back and forth ones, where if it can penetrate, great. If it can't, big problem. The weapons are going to be doing less damage to enemy armor protection than, any other standard infantry weapon would. The Dark Eldar using the weapons. So, the Dark Eldar have kind of the same advantages that the Eldar have. They have quick reaction speed, they have very good senses, they are very well trained, they have a pretty solid morale base, but the biggest thing here is training and experience. Dark Eldar go on lots of raids where they basically go uncontested. They are fighting planetary defense forces and other stuff like that, and while they are fighting inferior forces, they're getting experience. They're getting better with their weapons, they're getting more talented, they're learning how to work together a lot, and they're perfecting these, lightning raid tactics. And their weapons are all built around this idea. They're all centered on the concept of essentially, well, we deploy in one area, we conquer, we kill, we cause suffering, we top off of our larder, we grab a bunch of people, and we leave. Or we set up a more consistent, quote-unquote, relationship where the humans give us slaves, and we don't kill them. A very lucrative deal in Dark Eldari's eyes. But still, the big advantage of these weapons is that the Dark Eldar are very experienced with them. They certainly wouldn't be put off if a weapon wasn't working the way it was supposed to, or if an enemy had some sort of resistance to it. They would find ways around it. And I'll talk about that when I analyze these pictures, actually. The next thing is numbers, advantages, and disadvantages. Most Drukhari armies and forces are pretty low in numbers. They have their different cabals, or clans, or cults, or whatever. Those are organized with a lot of different, quote-unquote, war bands, or individual groups that go off and raid, and grab, and come back to Kamara to essentially rest and top off. A lot of their fighting is basically in between getting caught by enemies that were chasing after them anyway, or running into unfortunate resistance in a place where they weren't expecting it. Say, an Imperial Guard regiment is on a planet that they were intending to raid, and they didn't know that they were there. Because they pop out of the webway, and they're just kind of like, alright, here's the target, let's jump down. They might not necessarily know that there's a lot of resistance forces there, and if there are, the Drukhari are at a massive numerical disadvantage a majority of the time. So, Drukhari don't breed any faster than the Eldari do, and their population numbers remain relatively low compared to humans. So, on average, Drukhari raids will probably feature no more than 10 to 15,000, and that would be a very large raid. You could expect almost a tenth of that if it was a very small, like a survival raid. Or if they were hitting lots of areas at the same time, sending a couple hundred or a little bit less than 100 Drukhari might not be an unusual thing if a planet is used to their raids already and has kind of just learned when the Dark Eldar show up, you give over the old, the sick, and the dying, and they'll take them and go away. Not an uncommon thing with the Drukhari. They do cultivate certain human worlds to essentially give them slaves forever. And on those worlds, sending on like 50 Drukhari is it's not a bad plan. Just go ahead. You know, the humans aren't going to resist you. They've been trained by their parents and their parents before them. When the pointy-eared space elves with the spiky armor show up, you have to give over mom and dad because otherwise they'll kill us all. They get that mentality. But when it is that more reasonable, like a big raid onto a planet that's a well-held Imperial world, with a large PDF and with lots of defenses, you might see somewhere around 1,500 to 15,000 Drukhari. Again, that's a very large raid. That's going to be talking about something like multiple cruiser-class ships, maybe a half dozen escorts or so. But even then, they will be outnumbered by an Imperial Guard regiment, minimum 2 to 1, and they'll be outnumbered by a planetary defense force at somewhere in a rate between like 10 to 1 and 100 to 1. So a lot of the Drukhari, their strategy is based on overcoming the unbelievable numbers disadvantage that they are at 90% of the time, when they're on the offensive at least. So, as an advantage of that, they're prepped for it. They know that they're going to be at a numbers disadvantage. They've equipped a lot of their weapons and equipment to do things like break enemy morale. They have a lot of specialty units that can spook people out and operate independently to weaken resistance before the main force shows up. And they all have body armor, for the most part, witches and racks excluded for different reasons, but the Drukhari know that they're going to get shot a couple times. They're going to get shot at with usually low caliber auto weapons, maybe some rifle rounds, things like that. And they know that they have to be able to take 1 or 2 of those rounds on their protection before they can get into range, or before they can see the enemy that's fighting against them, or before they can target the next enemy that's shooting at them. So on the advantage side, they know that they're going to be outnumbered, and they prep for it with having all body armor, with having a lot of weapons that have full auto fire, with bringing a lot of vehicles that are very quick and can get them to locations where the enemies aren't resisting them as hard. And then the big disadvantage is just they have to do a lot more killing when they're on the offensive, and they can't replace their warriors as easily as the humans can. And especially their specialist warriors can be very hard to replace. You have to take specialists essentially out of Kamara and bring them with you, or convince them to come with you to replace the dead. So, big disadvantage. The other thing that kind of comes into this and justifies a lot of their weaponry is the big pro of raiding tactics and shock tactics. So, raiding tactics. The Drukhari show up to planets that aren't prepared, that don't know they're coming, that couldn't track them coming in because they're very stealthy, and they essentially burst onto a planet like a summer thunderstorm. They fill the skies with aerial aircraft and with aerial transports. They drop down onto vulnerable areas with civilians or with defense forces. They decapitate them. They very quickly intend to overwhelm an initial defensive force, break the will and the cohesion of the enemy, feast for as long as they need to, and then run away, essentially. They just hit, kill, decapitate, and then GTFO. And these raiding tactics make up for a lot of the disadvantages. The Drukhari would not do well in a protracted fight with an enemy against which they are not designed to kill them quickly. So, heavy Imperial Guard regiments, whether they're Storm, Shock, Assault, or Heavy regiments, or even Armored regiments, they would be very difficult for the Drukhari to overcome in the long run. To overwhelm them, to attack their command posts, to go after their logistics trains, just to stymie them, essentially, and to stun them into non-reaction, that leaves them in a place where the Drukhari can do what they need to and leave before the Guard get their feet back under them and actually get into the fight. And that is what a lot of their tactics are based off of. It's this idea of, well, if we throw an overwhelming sucker punch at the really start of the fight, and we manage to stun the prey, we can take what we need and be out of here before they can get back on their feet and start fighting again. And let's analyze these pictures for a moment. This one's really quick. We have two witches here with some very fancy melee weapons. We got a spiky spear here and a chain sword / whip thing here. And they're fighting against some orcs. But the main thing I want you to see here is, this is obviously an orcish held territory with a bunch of orcs here. But the other thing is, look at the aircraft. These are airborne transports and some of the Drukhari fighter wings, which the Drukhari have a very impressive air force, and I'll talk about that when we get to void combat or air combat for them. But this is kind of typical. Notice they're not going after any of the other orcs. They're not trying to grind through them. They're just trying to kill the war boss, throw all these guys into disarray, and then find the human slave pens, take the slaves that they need, run away back to Kamara. The thing here as well, look at these. These are Space Marines. Arguably a very dangerous, or arguably the apex predator of the standard Drukhari infantry would be Space Marines. They're very resistant to toxins and poisons. Drukhari poisons can still hurt them quite a bit, down to like giving them brain damage, damaging major functions, or severely giving them like muscular dystrophy and damage like necrosis and things like that. But they're all covered in really nice armor. These guys don't have their helmets on because Space Wolves are stupid, but other than that, they have really nice armor. And they're also using knives. Again, Space Wolves. I don't know why, but Space Wolves. That's my reasoning. But you can see here what they're doing. They've organized themselves into tight formations. They are intentionally going after the Marines with their melee weapons, so they're going after them with the bayonets, they're going after them with knives and mono-bladed weapons, and you can see, he's not just slashing at his chest or arm, he's going for throat, neck, head. These guys as well, they're lowering their weapons. Why are they lowering their weapons? Why aren't they going for the neck, gorget, or face? It's because the Marines know that they're going to go for that. They have their helmets off, they're thinking about protecting that. What the Drukhari are trying to do here, which is a very good tactic, is what I talk about a lot with Space Marines. Jam a bayonet, and if the bayonet sticks, hold down the trigger until the target is dead, or at least wounded. So the idea with the bayonet down with their spike rifles is they stab into the Marine's stomach or underneath an arm, and then they pull the trigger until spike after spike after spike of glassy material stabs through the Marine's armor and eventually manages to release the payload of poison. So it's a little bit of a desperate tactic. Obviously, they're not in a great situation here, but you can see as well, they've brought out the extra options. We have homunculi here, these kind of crazy melee boys. We have the big old vehicles back here, and we have the larger homunculi, the kind of floating flesh-welded creatures, coming out to resist them even further. So it's not like they're lining up a bunch of their basic troops to just get slaughtered. They are bringing out the reserves to deal with the Marines. So, moving on. I know this is going to be a long video, and it's going to continue to be a long video. I apologize. How it works and logic section and analysis. So, we've already talked about how the best kind of protection against a lot of Dark Eldar weapons is heavy and medium body armor. It's good at protecting you against their standard infantry weapons. It's good at protecting you against a lot of their melee weapons. Again, they are mono-bladed. A lot of them, they are monoblade weapons, but that doesn't mean that the Eldar are swinging them around with the strength of a Space Marine. They are very thin, they're spindly, they're very sharp, yes, but if you have thicker protection, bladed weapons will have a harder time getting through them easily. And I would argue with the Drukhari weapons being very, very serrated, it would make it even harder for them to do so. Damage prevention, a lot of this is going to come down to avoiding the poison, and if you do get poisoned, you're going to have to, like, go on dialysis and spend a lot of time in recovery, because unlike the Tyranids, who you could theoretically overcome a lot of their poisons with, say, standard combat stims and things of that nature that you might be able to use to heal yourself or to purify or purge the poison from your body, Drukhari Venoms are going to be much more virulent, or they're going to be designed to hurt you and stick in your system for a while. Mitigation, the best mitigation against these, again, would be armor or protection, also heavy vehicles, and outranging the Drukhari. It's very hard, but if you deprive them of their air power, if you deprive them of aircraft, if you have a lot of anti-aircraft equipment, or if you have a lot of shields or protection, if you could keep them from owning the skies, you have a pretty solid advantage over them, as they rely upon airborne transport and airborne support to effectively speed up their attacks. And counters, range is a big one. So having range over the Drukhari and having lots of heavy and medium support weapons like heavy stubbers or heavy bolters that will penetrate their armor and kill them, but also have fully automatic fire because, of course, the Drukhari are very fast, they have high reaction speed, they can't dodge bullets outside of, like, racks and witches. Witches because of a thing that we'll talk about later, and racks because they could literally shift into the shadows and diss a frickin' peer. But they are quick, they are fast, they have the ability to dodge out of the way of attacks that they see coming, and it can give them the edge that they need to get close enough to kill you, or to pop off a shot that kills somebody with a heavy weapon. So, you know, something that has fully automatic fire and packs more punch than, like, a light machine gun, because they do all have at least light carapace armor, so you want something that can penetrate a little bit. In my opinion, low-caliber autocannons and heavy bolters are probably the best here. Heavy bolters are a little bit worse than the autocannons because they fire slower, but they are way more lethal, so they're more useful against lots of different Dark Eldar enemies. I'll go into that. I'm talking about army and adversary stuff in this video. Sorry, it's going to be a while before I get back to all the Xenos after all the Chaos stuff gets done, so I'm just throwing in as much as I can here because I really do like the Drukhari. I love this faction a ton, and I don't get to talk about them, play against them, see them in media, or really think about the logic of their army that much because, let's be honest, how often do these guys even show up in a fun way where they're not just, well, they were here, they killed everyone, and then they left. But, yeah, moving on from the sad part of me not seeing or talking about the Drukhari for a little bit, we talk about bladed and power weapons. So, on the power weapon side, we have things like the standard Drukhari power weapons. I think some of the claves are also, yeah, most of them are also, like, low-grade power weapons or some sort of power weapon. But I'm sure there are some of them that are a little bit more traditional. I think the demi-claves that the Cabalites have, or that the racks have, might be a little bit more standard, but some of the larger claves, the more offensive ones, will be power weapons. And then they also have standard power swords like the Eldari do. They're shaped much more like cutlasses. They're very swept like cavalry sabers, again, both because the Drukhari use a lot of flying vehicles, and also because they're very willowy. They're talented fighters. They're doing a lot of spins and flips and hoops and all this stuff. So having a long, straight-bladed sword designed for dueling, that's not really the point. Most people are going to be able to overpower a Drukhari in a straight-up battle of strength duel. They have no interest in doing that. They just want to hamstring you and then leave you to get captured. Monomolecular blades. Almost all of the Drukhari weapons are monomolecular. They're that kind of perfect chisel-shaped angle that both self-sharpens and is incredibly durable while being hair-splitter sharp. It is very difficult to get with normal human technology, but of course, the Dark Eldar have Eldar technology, so monomolecular blades are pretty common and very cool. So, a lot of these are also full steel designs. They are one piece, funny joke. They are one piece. They're very smooth and clean line designs. Again, a lot of them are spiked or hooked. This is mostly for that whole idea of we want to cause as much physical suffering as possible. But outside of that, a lot of these are pretty durable weapons. Now they are thin and wispy, so in comparison, so if you had a standard weapon made to these specifications with standard steel, they would likely shatter, break, and fall apart. But in the hands of the Drukhari, because of their fighting style, they essentially use them in such a way that it makes them a lot more durable than they look. So, when I say that they're durable, it's more like they won't break as they would if a human was just hammering away at something with them. So, they have the speed and the expertise and the precision to use these weapons in a way that they don't break or they don't suffer as much wear and tear as they would if a human was using them. So, moving on. Shard weapons. So, shard weapons are a little bit weird. They include splinter rifles, splinter pistols, shard carbines, all this kind of stuff. These ones are hard to explain. They have this kind of big barrel in the back, or little barrel in the case of the shard carbine, and then they have a set barrel in front that is usually of rifle length. How these work is I have them listed as metal toxin rail splinters. How these work is that there is a crystalline metal, or just a straight up crystal, but I think it's a crystalline metal structure inside of that central area, that kind of Fabergé egg-looking ammo container, let's say. This material is laced with extremely deadly or extremely painful toxins. So it is a toxic metal. It's been doped with it, or it's been completely coated in it, and what the weapon does is essentially it shreds off a tiny little thin set of metal splinters from this central kind of reservoir of metal, and it sprays them out like little needles. But it's described as crystals, right? I think that it's actually referring to the crystalline structure that the weapons shave off. So, you can have metal crystals. This is a thing if you've ever seen, like, bismuth, or if you've seen any type of, like, rapidly forming metal. There's a crystalline structure. It's at a very low level. You have to get very close, but there's a crystalline matrix in steel, for example, that I think that's what they're referring to. It's almost like shards or flakes of metal that are coated in poison, and they are shot literally via a magnetic rail. There's a railgun in there. This magnetic rail that accelerates a burst or a line of these little tiny, I wouldn't say monomolecular, but little metal flakes or metal spines or shards at your target. Now, this has some serious upsides and some serious downsides. The upsides are that at close range, it can kind of splinter into a lot of things, so hitting almost like a shotgun at very close range, because it is spraying out of the end, yes, but it's also a whole bunch of other little pieces of splintered metal in addition to the main splinter or group of splinters or line of splinters that you're shooting out the front with actual accuracy. So on the one hand, there is that kind of spray effect from just firing shredded metal out of a railgun. On the other hand, these are not ballistically supported, and they are not really they're not really designed for super long range. However, they do fire on full auto. So even if they don't penetrate at longer range, they might still be accurate enough to, say, penetrate light armor. Probably not light armor, but at least penetrate something like exposed skin. So, when I say that they don't lose as much effectiveness or accuracy with range, it's more the idea of, like, you could spray and pray with a splinter rifle, and you can hit the target multiple times with poisonous ammunition, essentially. There are other versions that say that it fires a single crystalline, like, dart, or a shred of crystal. I think these are kind of disambiguations of the same type of weapon. Again, there's different ways to use them, for sure. I'm sure that the rifle or the cannon might fire a larger, more ballistically stable version, but the carbine, for sure, is firing flakes and needle-sized pieces of metal. Those would penetrate light body armor at close range, but at longer range it would struggle with body armor, and it would probably only be able to penetrate cloth and skin and things like that. The splinter rifle, I think that might be a little bit better in terms of, like, that 500-meter shot, trying to make that with some level of accuracy, but it is shooting out at decent speed with the rail cannon, with the rail effect, the railgun effect, essentially magnetic acceleration, so pretty decent accuracy, but it will lose penetrating power over distance. And in theory, especially with the shorter ones like the Splinter Pistol and the Shard Carbine, I wouldn't trust on it being accurate with a single shot. I would say spray a couple rounds, maybe a burst of 20 or 30, because these probably have a decent ammo reservoir, and to make sure that you absolutely coat the target so that you're not relying on a single shot. With the Splinter Rifle, again, you might be able to get out and touch a little bit more like what you would with a battle rifle, and with the cannon, that's even better range and penetration. Dark matter weapons and blast weapons. So they call them blast weapons. It's a dark matter pistol. So we talked about this a little bit with the Necrons, right? This idea of antimatter being used as a weapon. These kind of anti-protons and anti-electrons being shot out of a gun and interacting with a target in such that their atoms touch the antimatter explodes, detonation. Now on tabletop, these are basically handheld melta weapons, and they include the blast pistol and the dark lance, and I think the heat lance as well, but the heat lance might be melta. I might have forgotten that. So either way, at least the blast pistol and the blast rifle, the blaster, sorry. Yeah, the blast pistol and the blaster, goodness. These all use, how do I say it? I view these as a little bit different from the Necron ones. The Necron ones seem to take very pure antimatter that they manage to isolate using technology or star material or whatever, and then they throw a little pocket of it, like a plasma weapon, at a target, and it expands and explodes all at once, interacting with the environment, connecting with atoms, and detonating. The dark matter or the blast or beam weapons for the Dark Eldar, and to a degree for the Eldar, seem to work off of a different principle. And I judge this by the way that they have a beam following them. Now, the Necron weapons have a projector. It fires a little ball. The Dark Eldar and the Eldar weapons have a beam. Now, what I think this is, and why I think these are different, is essentially that beam is a laser. An actual legit laser that is projected from the weapon and effectively isolates this stream of antimatter going through the center of it, and that's what does most of the damage. This beam, this laser, it's garbage. It is essentially created just to make it so that there are no atoms in the path of the weapon's beam. Because if there were atoms in the way, then the antimatter would react with them and damage the weapon, probably kill the shooter, and have issues with striking a target at range. Obviously, this will have issues striking a target at range anyway, because the laser will eventually weaken, and the antimatter stream, I believe it is a stream of antimatter particles or antimatter atoms, coming out of the weapon, whether it's in a burst or in a line, might explode at a distance because the weapon's beam will weaken and the vacuum that it's created around these particles will collapse and it will react and explode. But what that means is that essentially the blast weapons will shoot a laser out and then they will spray a thin, almost single atom or single set of molecules in a line of antimatter. And when that hits the target, the laser is no longer protecting them, they strike atoms, they detonate and explode. And that creates this effect of you point at a target, it shoots it with a laser, and then there is an explosion on the target. How did that happen? How did the antimatter get there? Effectively, the laser is insulating it from anything that it could react with until it hits the target. And so that's how I see a lot of the Dark Lances and the Disintegration Cannons and all of that stuff, all of the blast weaponry as well. Again, not sure about the Heat Lance and the Dark Lance. They might be slightly different. But at least for the blast weapons and for the other dark matter weapons, I think this idea of antimatter protected by a laser beam, making it so that less antimatter particles are required, because it's usually of lower grade than the Necron stuff, but also that it's a little bit more efficient. It's not sacrificing a big old dollop of antimatter every time you fire the weapon. It's a line of individual atoms that are doing pretty much equivalent work, but they are less dangerous and a little bit easier to use. Special weapons. So, monofilament, poison, acid, and electricity, haywire, melta, and laser. That's a lot of stuff. Let's go backwards, shall we? So, Laser weapons. This includes stuff like, I believe the fusion pistol and dark lance are both laser weapons. Dark lance is kind of like a las cannon. And then the fusion pistols, they can work both ways. The shredder is monofilament, but essentially the laser weapons for the Drukhari are a little bit more on the armor-piercing side. They're designed more to penetrate armor, more to damage protection, because they are heavy weapons for the Drukhari. They're melta weapons, I believe the fusion pistol and the... Oh, shoot, what's the other one? Yeah, no, I think it's just the heat lance and the fusion pistol. They work almost exactly the same as standard melta weapons. It's metal and surrounds with plasma, superheats it, melts through the target. Essentially works the same way that human ones do. Haywire weapons. These come in a lot of different forms. You have the Haywire Blaster, and you have Haywire Grenades. These zap the absolute crap out of people. Essentially, they are designed to hit targets that have some electrical system or are weakly protected and electrocute them to the point where the tank's auspex might not work anymore, the power armor that dude is wearing is no longer working. Essentially, it's designed to make electrical objects that the target is wearing no longer work. And that includes both the grenades and the weapons. Acid, not a ton of these are super common. They can be on certain weapons or in certain... on certain melee weapons or in certain other weapons. So there can be gauntlets or blades that can be covered in acid. But again, this is designed to cause maximum pain and suffering. It's not necessarily something that they're relying on to do the killing. Poison. A lot more common, and to be honest, you should expect that most Dark Eldar weapons are going to be coated in poison, at least at the start of the fight, because why wouldn't you? Almost all of the Drukhari have these kind of weapons. So, why not cover them in poison? Monofilament. So this comes in with the Shredder. The Shredder is a net gun, effectively, that shoots out the weave wheeled, or this kind of spray of monofilament wires. It grabs a target and then does like a nasty saw trap with them. It contracts and cuts them. Now it can just chop people into little cubes if you stay in there for long enough, or if the Drukhari is particularly in a hurry. But it can also just hold people and make sure that they don't get out, because if they push their way out, they're going to cut their fingers off. Very nasty. I am a big fan of monofilament weapons, and Shredder's not my favorite, but it is a pretty decent one. The other thing is that there are... the other one is the Stinger pistol. That's the one with the acid. So that is effectively just a needle gun from the Imperium, but it can have acid and or toxin. So, just talking about weapons for a bit, I'd like to talk about these. We have the ones down here, the Agonizer. It's like a bladed electrical whip. Very nasty. Razor flails and weighted flails. All these, like, hooked blades that can switch between whips and knives. We have the Mandrakes, or the Mandrakes, or the rack weaponry. These are made out of glimmer steel, which is kind of that monomolecular thing that the Drukhari have going for them. Impalers, these can either be spears or they can just be spiked, barbed things. And the Hellglaive, the Clave, and the Demiclave, which is just a little shorter ones. Witch knives, punch daggers, vambrace blades. A really common... God, the Hydra Gauntlet is so crazy. I love these. But essentially, all of these have kind of the same concept behind them, right? The type of fighting style that Drukhari melee weapons require is three things in absolute. It is violent, it is aggressive, and it is quick. So none of these are dueling blades. None of these are necessarily long or tough enough to go hand-to-hand with a chainsword or hand-to-hand with a really nice melee weapon. They're not designed for that. The Drukhari aren't built for that type of combat outside of witches, necessarily, or racks or mandrakes. But these weapons are designed for the absolute offensive punch of the Drukhari to come from basically an unprotected strike. They expect themselves to be skilled enough, to be fast enough, and to be wily enough to use their weapons to push aside or to block a single stroke, and then respond with such speed and capability that they can kill the target or maim, disarm, severely injure them with a single strike. And you see this especially with things like the witch knives or like the clave. Clave is basically designed to be used in 3 different ways. You can use it like a great sword with both hands on the hilt down here. You can use it with one hand on the hilt and one hand on the first grip to use it like an axe or like a pick, where you have a little bit of fulcrum action. Or you can use it with the tertiary grip and the secondary grip and use it like a fighting Kenbo staff where you can block, you can push aside strikes, and then you can use it almost like a big bladed pair of brass knuckles to punch, hit, smack people with the spike, and use it as much more of a dueling option. Which is another one of the really great things. If there's anything else, I want to see a clave in real life and how you'd use to fight with it, because there's so many cool fighting styles that you could develop with the clave, because it is a combination between like the Uruk-hai cleaver, which is one of my favorite weapons in all of fiction. I love the Uruk-hai, and I love the Uruk-hai cleaver, but it is a combination between that and like specialty dueling weapons and half swording. So very cool. If anything, if I ever get like a CNC machine or something, I'm chopping me out a clave. I want to make one so bad. Patterns and types. Did I go over the all? Oh yeah, I went over all the art here. Sorry. So to describe things again for you, just from these images, all the splinter weapons are basic infantry weapons, with the splinter cannon being kind of the heavy bolter equivalent. Just fires larger rounds. Heat Lance is Melta, Haywire is electricity. The Dark Lance is that, how do you say, las cannon equivalent. It is a heavy projection anti-armor weapon. Again, not sure if that one is a specific type of energy. Might be Melta, might be las cannon equivalent. I can't remember exactly. You'll have to forgive me. That's the one that I didn't, research directly because I thought I knew what it was. And when it comes to it, I missed that one. But it's either the las cannon one or it has some sort of Melta ability. Sorry. But you can see there how the standard infantry weapons, not great at armor penetration, all the melee weapons, not super great at armor penetration, but then all of the special weapons, the Heat Lance, the blasters, the cannons, the Haywire guns, the Dark Lance, all of that is heavy armor piercing, designate armor piercing. They only have one weapon that's a special weapon that isn't designated armor piercing, and that's the Splinter Cannon. And even that could probably do in light vehicles pretty well. So, patterns and types. The most common is rifles. That's the one you're going to see on a majority of the standard Dark Eldar soldiers. Pistols are going to be limited to leadership units, but they aren't uncommon. Interestingly enough, because a lot of the Drukhari have melee weapons, they tend to favor pistols quite a bit. And because their pistols are really, really good, why not? Heavy weapons, you don't see these as much, and when you do see heavy weapons for the Drukhari, they are mounted on vehicles. So you'll see here a lot of their kind of flying, floaty vehicles. They're kind of barges and barks that they use. These ones up here. They will all have a Dark Lance in the front, or some other heavy weapon like a Shard Cannon, essentially as mobile support weapons. Drukhari aren't really strong enough to haul around big weapons themselves, and brace them and deal with recoil and all that stuff, so they will have vehicles to do that for them. Not to say that they couldn't hold some heavy weapons. We saw here things like the Blaster or the Shredder they can hold, and the Disintegration Cannon to a lesser degree. Disintegrator Cannon, again, same thing, it's another dark matter weapon. But vehicle weapons will kind of be where you'll see those heavy emplaced weapons. Melee weapons. So, even the basic guys will have backup weapons. Like you can see here, these warriors have all of their, I would definitely call this more the heavy carapace. You can see the shoulders. You can see the extra layered plates that they have covering the whole body. But the more light carapace might be something like this, or more something like this, very flexible and very pleated. The thicker armor is going to be the heavy carapace. The thinner, more samurai lacquered layered armor is going to be the light carapace. But even these guys, they probably had spike rifles at one point. You can see this gentleman definitely has a spike rifle over here. But they're wading in with their melee weapons, and you can see they're big, they're long-limbed, they're scary, they're tough, and they will absolutely shred a guardsman if they're not prepped for them. These guys as well. They're swapping over and choosing to use melee weapons because it tops them off. It gives their souls that extra support that they need. And this guy as well. So you can see here, this is obviously a melee specialist. This is one of those kind of flesh homunculi, I believe. One of the kind of messed up flesh abominations that they have, where they've taken an Eldar or something like it and kind of grafted weapons and stuff onto it. Or it might just be some Dark Eldar specialist that I don't necessarily know by name. But clearly they can operate with just melee weapons as well. And the big thing here is that witches, specifically, as the wardenesses of the gladiatorial pits of Kamara, and as some of their most impressive fighters, witches use pretty much exclusively melee weapons. And their weapons range from, as you can see here, kind of that razor flail that's been made into a greatsword, into nasty little knives, and they wear no body armor at all. They wear shoulder pads, maybe some knee and thigh pads, but really their torso is unprotected because they are the absolute pinnacle of melee Dark Eldar. They are very proud of their prowess. They train all the time. They are more physically fit than the average Dark Eldar. They are a little bit stronger than the average Eldar in general, and I would compare them equally with the average Imperial Guardsman. Now, there's probably Guardsmen who are bigger and stronger than a witch, but if it were a straight-up fist fight between a witch and a regular human, the witch probably has a pretty significant advantage because not only is she equal in strength to the average human, but she is also as fast as an Eldar and as wily and well-trained as any Eldar, if not better trained, because they are some of the most experienced gladiators in the pit. And they have very strong souls for that reason, or because of that reason. So, uses, importance, and logistics. All of them are the Dark Eldar of Kamara, and yes, I realize that I spelled that wrong. I apologize. The Dark Eldar of Kamara. On the side of weird stuff that aren't included, we have the homunculi, racks, witches, harlequins, and drakes, mandrakes. So, I'm going to talk about harlequins a very small amount because they're not a common force. And when they usually engage in combat, it's essentially using Eldar or Dark Eldar weaponry that they're just kind of using in their own way. Harlequins are the next step above in terms of speed, reaction, skill. They've just reached the absolute pinnacle of what Eldar as a race are capable of. And they are a little bit more blessed and a lot faster and more deadly than even the witches. So where I consider witches the pinnacle of the Drukhari kind of strength and skill tree, and a little bit speed tree, the Harlequins are another significant step above them. Racks and Mandrakes, these guys are using heavy melee weapons. They're using claves, they're using demi-claves, they're using various melee weapons like the homunculi will. And then there are obviously bigger homunculi that they're pumping up with drugs and things like that. But these guys, the reason I don't talk about them a lot is that they're not only not in every Drukhari force necessarily, they will be in a lot of them, but they're not going to be in any of the raiding forces necessarily, unless it is a very resistant world. In which case they will be called in as heavy support, essentially. But the other reason I don't mention them is a lot of their weapons just kind of boil down to big claw that's electrical, or big melee weapon, or big nasty this, big nasty that. There's not a lot of things that are particularly complex with them. And even witches, racks, or even witches and mandrakes, they really just use more Dark Eldar melee weapons, which we've talked about at length, and they're very beautiful, and I love them quite a bit. However, they do not need individual discussion, as far as I know, they don't use anything all that unique, other than the mandrakes and or the racks specializing in the use of the clave, which is a very respectable thing. It just reminds me so much of the Batlith as well. It's like a Batlith and a Uruk-hai chopper had a kid. And I love both of those weapons, so having them together, I love the clave. I'm obsessed with this thing. So, that's why I don't talk about Harlequins just yet. I'll talk about them a little bit more in the Eldar video, which is likely going to be the next one. But here, I've talked about the racks a little bit, the witches, the homunculi, and the mandrakes. I keep forgetting mandrakes, gosh. Normal weapons in Dark Eldar hands, like power weapons and standard energy or melta weapons. Again, like all Eldar stuff, you can expect a couple of things. They're going to be lighter, they're going to be more swept, and a lot more artistry-like, designed for a very specific, very quick, very precise way of warfare. And in the case of the Dark Eldar, they are also going to have a lot of things that make them particularly painful. You know, cover them in spikes, have a lot of melee weapons grafted onto ranged weapons, have a lot of, poison or acid or things like that on the weapons themselves or able to be injected by the weapons. But other than their kind of design being different, lighter for the Eldar, for their bodies to handle, and for their combat style to accommodate for, in general, they work about the same way. The actual technology for these things is not all that different. By the way, lovely image here. We got somebody hunting with a harpoon coming out of a dark lance, and then little squad of 3 on their little bark. These things have sails. Look, the boats have always looked a little silly to me, but this artwork just makes them look very cool. We got, looks like some Harlequins, and then a Death Speaker here. Again, if I ever do an individual video on Harlequins, which I don't think I'm going to do, because they're a very rare faction, and I'm not sure anybody cares, to the point of giving them their own video, you can tell me about it in the comments if you disagree, and I'll modify the Eldar video to talk about them as well. But, yeah, in general, I won't talk about them as much. Similar-ish thing, I would say, with the, with other factions, but we'll get into that later. But if you'd like me to talk about them, I will talk about them. They just don't belong necessarily in this video. And then over here, we have a Flesh Melder. One of those kind of guys in the Dark Eldar society that mess around with making living things more useful to the Drukhari and creating abominations like these ones that they have here. They will either make them out of humans, or they will vat grow them, or they will genetically modify them, do any of these kinds of things to create soldiers, warriors, entertainment for the gladiatorial pits of Kamara. And you can see here, very effective. They have lots of arms, they have lots of metal bits. Very cool guys. They're absolutely horrifyingly sadistic, and yeah, as a fellow Nightlord fan, I cannot really blame them. Moving on to acknowledgements. I hope this one wasn't too rushed for you. I did spend a solid amount of time on this, but these guys have an incredibly extensive armory, and all of them have names, and I took about as much time as I could to go through each of them. I'm also a little bit more tired today, I apologize, but I will be trying to keep the upload schedule as I said. In the next couple of days, I will keep uploading as much as I can, and then after I finish the Xenos Weapons videos, I will probably take a short time to perfect the next few, and then get them out to you in a similar kind of burst, because I want to try and see whether you guys like them all at the same time or all within the few couple days, or if you prefer pairs, or one every couple of days, like I take a short day off in between uploads. But anything like that, leave it in the comments. Please keep voting. I do want to see our first archive video. I saw a crazy comeback. I was watching all of the replies, all the comments. I reply to every single comment, by the way. I do my best to do that, and I'll keep trying to do that no matter how big we get, because I think it's very personal for me to talk to you guys as I do these, because there's absolutely no point in me sitting here and talking to you if I'm not able to get feedback to you and understand what you guys want and don't want. So never think that I'm not reading them, never think that I'm not responding to them. I actively want to hit every single one of you and talk to you at some point, because I really care about what you think about the faction, because, again, like I said before in other videos, it doesn't matter what the book says, it doesn't matter what the Lex says, it doesn't matter what the wiki says. What we say goes as people who enjoy the genre and as people who enjoy the setting. I don't care what GW says. I don't care what the company says. I don't care what they say I can or cannot say about the setting. I will say what I think is correct and what I can logically support, even if there's a disagreement with it. And I would like you guys to engage in this with me so that we together can form a better version of the setting together with our kind of... It's not headcanon if we all believe it. Then it becomes canon. That's my mentality. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. This is just another example here. This is such good art. Look how absolutely hella ripped this witch is. Her arm is the size of this Sister of Battles in power armor. She is yoked out. We got abs, six packs. She's huge. Again, she's like 7 feet tall of solid muscle and just Drukhari menace. Love witches. So cool to see a Drukhari who is just willing to straight up strip down to the leather and run the ones with power armored people. Very cool. So, with all of that insane spurging out of the way, I wish you all a lovely good night.